So we've just learned that the economy has contracted 7% in the second quarter, one of the largest contractions on record. But we have the curious situation of household income actually rising by 2.2% over that period. How can we be in such a bad recession, but households are richer?
Well, this is the government acting very quickly with their emergency stimulus. They literally had that changes to JobSeeker put in place within a week, and then JobKeeper came a week later. And we're seeing in these numbers a huge increase in government social assistance. So that's really what all that's about. And it didn't translate, though, into spending. Consumer spending still fell almost 10%, and or 12%, and discretionary spending fell 17%, according to the ABS. So there was that really quick response from the government, which is, you could argue it's almost overstimulated the household sector.
So to some extent, then, the real pain from the recession is basically yet to be felt.
Yeah, well, the economy right now is sort of in a bit of a phony recession. It's in a holding pattern supported by government stimulus. The job losses are real. There's no two ways about it. But people are getting extra payments. And of course, this all will change next year as those emergency supports are pulled back. So not just JobKeeper winding down and JobSeeker normalising, but we're also going to see the bank moratorium finish in January next year. And of course, that will be sort of the day of reckoning around mortgages and also around sort of SME loans. So really, we're in a bit of a holding pattern on the economy, despite how severe these numbers are. The real effects and the real position of the Australian economy won't really be known until next year.
And just moving on to the third quarter, of course, we're basically halfway through that now, more than halfway, or almost halfway rather. Is there some chance that the economy will shrink in this quarter as well?
Look, it probably won't. It was always going to have a very decent bounce, given when we reopened in May, June, we did get a lot of improvement in spending, and various figures coming through from the ABS highlighted this. The Victorian lockdown, stage 3, then stage 4, will have a huge impact on the overall economic activity, but it's going to sort of drift into Q4. So I think we'll get a bounce in Q3 still. It could have actually been about a 2 or 3% bounce. I think it'll probably be more like 1 or 1.5%. The risk is that we actually get another contraction, albeit a small one, in Q4 because of what's going on in Victoria right now.
Now, just on the timing of this data, of course, we're talking about June figures this week. That's quite some time ago.
Yeah.
Is it really acceptable that it takes the ABS so long to calculate these quarterly GDP figures?
We are literally one of the last countries in the world to get our reading on Q2. And Q2 was always the big number. And, we really aren't getting this figure early enough. The ABS has done an excellent job in producing special reports, news series to give us insight. And to be fair, we have a pretty good insight into what's going on in this economy. But our GDP figures really need to come out earlier, even if they do a preliminary and then a final. But we're lagging the whole world on this, and there's critical detail in this. Like, we've only just found out that there was a huge surge in the household saving rate, which is really important. We've only really know what the decline in services spending was, because we don't have any partial indicator of that. So I think, look, David Gruen's come in as the statistician. He's done an absolutely fantastic job under these emergency sort of conditions, but I think the next cab off the rank for him has got to be to get these GDP figures out earlier.
Just on the household saving rate, so it surged from 6%, I think, to 20%. Does that mean that basically households will basically pay down their savings in coming quarters?
Well, look, it's just a reflection of the fact that people could not spend. There was just all these restrictions, and it shows you this huge accumulation, and we're seeing it in the banks. The banks are filling up with cash in the last 3 or 4 months. And it also shows you that there's a pent-up demand there, that there is money that would otherwise have been spent on overseas travel, on arts and recreation, on going out to restaurants and everything, on all these services which we've been restricted from spending our money on. And that can be released when the restrictions are released. Now, of course, overseas travel is going to be one of the last things to go, but the internal border restrictions, I think, are holding that spending back.
Well, just on those internal border restrictions, I mean, can you glean anything from the national accounts about how much they are actually costing the economy, those restrictions?
I think that's more of a Q3 story. I think the Q2 numbers really just paint a picture of what the initial shock was, and that's really across the whole country. I think we're going to get a lot more insight into that over the course of the next few months. I mean, there's clearly a tourism story here, and it's significant. You know, people don't actually do a lot of holidaying in their own state. You know, they do like to go to Queensland or WA or what have you, and other people like to come to New South Wales. So I think that's a critical element of it. The other one is the supply chain issue, which we really are only getting bits and pieces of information on, but we know that Victoria is a major hub, and that's having an effect into the rest of the country. And of course there will be disruptions across you know, New South Wales, Queensland is a really critical border. So there's money to be spent, it's being held up from being spent and held up from being released into the economy to create jobs or to get those jobs back that we've lost. So you know, the border closures are material.
Now just moving on to central banking, of course, we've seen recently that the Federal Reserve in the US has changed its inflation target to some sort of inflation averaging. Now, we also heard this week that the RBA has expanded its term lending facility to $200 billion. What implications does the Fed change have for Australia, firstly?
Well, the Fed hasn't actually done much. They've actually just said we're going to target 2% inflation, which has been their target the whole time, on average over time, which is essentially what the RBA's been doing the whole time. So they've just got more flexibility. And really this is, you know, one of their last shots in the barrel, so to speak, for monetary policy. And it's all about forward guidance. It's all about sending a message to the broader community that as inflation picks up, they're not going to mechanically tighten, that they can allow inflation to go above 2. But they've been very clear, some of the other governors, that it's 2.5 they'll allow it to go to, not 4 or 5, which you know, some commentators are talking about. So they're just being pragmatic, but they're doing it now because they want everyone in the community to know that they'll let the economy run for a while. Now, this is, I think, one of the great failings of modern monetary policy is that the faith that people put, the central bankers put, in giving forward guidance. And the RBA is playing that card very hard at the moment. They've actually used the 3-year interest rate target of 0.25% as also a forward guidance for the cash rate. It's not going to move for 3 years. I don't think it's as a powerful tool, but it's one of their last tools. The RBA this week has used the extension of the term funding facility beyond September, I think, is purely a reflection of the fact that the bank moratoria will finish in January, and the banks may start to run into some troubles with losses because they won't really know what their losses to their mortgage customers or the small business customers are going to be until after the moratoria. And it's really an insurance policy that if the banks run into any problems raising money, they can come to the RBA, because the reality is the banks are full of cash at the moment and they have not really used this facility. So the RBA is on hold. They have set policy to their ultimate stimulatory setting, you know, this lower bound, and they're really not going to do much for the next few years. There's going to be a lot of commentators putting pressure on them to do something. Negative rates is going to be the big one, but they've ruled that out for good reason. And the reality is, I think the only other thing they've really got up their sleeve is if the government runs into funding trouble in the debt markets and they come and do QE. And then, as they've said, that's, you know, there's no sign of that at the moment. So what the Fed's done is really quite mild, quite pragmatic, very little implication for the RBA.
Okay. Thanks very much, Warren.